Welcome to my Pokémon Platinum Hardcore Nuzlocke walkthrough, a series where I look to complete a hardcore Nuzlocke of Pokémon Platinum while providing as much info and guidance as I possibly can along the way. And for those of you who wish to complete their own hardcore Nuzlocke of Pokémon Platinum, hopefully you find this helpful. It feels so incredibly refreshing to hop into another generation. For those of you who don't know, I spent the last several months in Pokémon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald making content exclusive to the Generation 3 games. And now, it's time to do it all over again in Sinnoh. But this walkthrough will be very different from the one I did for Emerald. Before starting my channel, I had already completed a few hardcore Nuzlockes of the Generation 3 games, and I had a lot of exposure simply from all the wipes that I had. Not so much with Platinum, and in fact, I have only one single hardcore Nuzlocke attempt with the game. For anyone wondering, I lost, by the way. I grew up with Pearl version, and that was it, so diving as deep as I can into Platinum all of these years later is going to be quite the journey. With a single attempt worth of experience, I'll be creating this walkthrough as a true beginner, and I'll be looking for you guys to help me along the way. And without further ado, the road from Gen 4 Casual to Platinum Master starts now. Let's do this. Oh man, God, I'm getting all excited. This feels so weird. I feel like I just unwrapped a new present on Christmas morning. Some of the things I'll definitely be pointing out as we go are all the differences between Platinum versus Diamond and Pearl. Like this snow. What the hell is this? It's such a small detail, but I love it. I'm also just looking forward to emulating this experience, so the slower bits of this game will go by a bit quicker. I know Platinum made some improvements to the overall performance, but I imagine playing on handheld would still be pretty rough in comparison to the other generations. I would still love to have the physical copy of this game one day though. I think now is a good time to start really getting the ball rolling here with starter selection. I've done plenty of research in general on Platinum so that I could be fairly prepared for the game overall, and the starter selection is no different. I'm also just weird like that. Like, doing homework on Pokemon is actually just really fun for me for some reason. In general, I've heard that you really can't go wrong with any of these options necessarily, although there seems to be a pretty clear-cut ranking when you compare them with each other. I personally chose Turtwig in the attempt that I did before this walkthrough, and he was fantastic. Honestly, one of the best early to mid-game Pokemon, I would say for sure. Does great against Rourke and Fantina. Grotto will be bulky enough to help out on the Mars and Jupiter fights as well, and as it turns out, getting Torterra and Earthquake at level 32 is actually utterly insane on paper and in practice, just in time for Maylene and her Lucario as well. Obviously does well against Volkner later on as well, but this line does have its shortcomings, primarily being a bit slow and having a 4x weakness to Ice. Still, a fantastic Pokemon overall, and I would say that the Turtwig line is without question the most beginner-friendly starter line out of these three. Out of our three choices here, I'd say he's your second best option overall. Now your best option overall, but perhaps the least beginner-friendly, would be Chimchar and his evolutions. In a generation where fire types are few and far in between, having a strong one immediately from the start is extremely useful. We aren't in the Hoenn region anymore. Fire types actually excel in the Sinnoh region. The two biggest upsides for Chimchar as far as matchups go is against Gym Leader Candace and the Cyrus fight within the Distortion world. I've been told that these are two of the hardest boss fights in the entire game, and Infernape is one of the very small handful of Pokemon that can fairly easily deal with Candace's Frostlass and Cyrus's Weavile. The Chimchar line will find pretty great use against the whole region in general, but like I mentioned earlier, this line is much more difficult to use. This is due to Infernape's glass cannon nature. He's extremely fast and powerful, but if you don't calculate your damage properly, your Fire Monkey will very quickly go down in flames. With that being said, I still believe, at least at this moment, that Chimchar is overall the best option to go with. And finally, we have my personal favorite Sinnoh starter in Piplup. Quick aside, Empoleon is cool as hell, and I don't care what anyone else says or thinks about that statement. Water and Steel? That's so freaking cool! Anyway, while the Piplup line is the weakest of the three starter lines in my opinion, Empoleon is still a fantastic Pokemon. If you noticed, I said Empoleon there, and that's because the main thing bringing him down is his pre-evolutions. When I look at how Piplup and Prinplup match up against the first half of this game, it's not very good. The biggest issue is their learn set. You'll have to deal with Bubble, Peck, and Metal Claw until level 24 when you finally get Bubble Beam. Two of those moves utilize Prinplup's weak weaker physical attack stat as well, which is not good. The matchups aren't great either. Sure, you'll do fine against Rourke, but you'll need to rely on other encounters to deal with Gardenia and Fantina. He can't do much against Maylene either, and by the time you reach Wake and Pastoria, you'll already have your Empoleon. Plus, on top of all that, there are an absurd amount of water encounters in Platinum, so there are plenty of other water types to choose from. While I definitely believe that Piplup is the worst starter selection here for all the reasons I mentioned above, it's still not a bad choice by any means. There may be a ton of water types in this game, but Empoleon is one of the best. With that long-winded explanation now out of the way, for my first attempt of the walkthrough, I'm going to go with Chimchar. I went with Turtwig during my single Nuzlocke attempt of Platinum, and I've played with Piplup a lot in the past with Pearl, so I think Chimchar will be a lot of fun. I also don't get to use fire types all that often, honestly, especially coming from a 9-month stay in the Hoenn region. After we picked up our Fire Monkey, we faced off against our rival in a brutal battle of endless, growls, I guess. Did a little bit of training on Route 201, picked up a hidden mushroom for some extra cash, got our free potion from this person, grabbed our Pokedex for Professor Rowan, picked up the TM for return, which is pretty nice honestly, but it won't be super good until a bit later, and finally we get our first Pokeballs from Dawn, and we can now start catching Pokemon. Now for me personally, I like to use the capture location listed on your Pokemon summary page to determine my encounters for each route, and for my runs, I include starter Pokemon as well. So since Chimchar was obtained on Route 201, our first two encounters will actually come from Lake Verity and Route 202 instead. Our very first encounter of the walkthrough is going to be a Starly. Very nice pickup, and it's worth mentioning that this Pokemon is basically guaranteed to obtain for the most part, due to the abundance of early game routes where they reside. Starly itself is quite weak, but once it evolves into Staravia, at level 14 by the way, which is super early, and later on Staraptor, you'll find loads of value in this line. Both evolutions are fast, hit hard, especially with wing attack at level 9, and come with arguably the greatest ability for Nuzlocking in Intimidate. Flying types in general perform very well against the majority of the matchups you'll encounter in Platinum, with only a few of them being unfavorable. Plus, there are a lot more earthquakes in this game compared to earlier generations like Emeralds, so having an immunity to ground type attacks is very useful. Oh, and Staraptor gets close combat upon evolving as well, which just adds some very nice coverage that not a whole lot of other regional birds usually get. Just checked our new Starly, and not only does it have an adamant nature, but she is also holding a Yachi Berry, which cuts the damage of a super effective ice move in half. I totally forgot that these types of berries existed in this generation. It's weird because I didn't run into any of them in my original attempt of Platinum, unless I'm just blind and missed them. Does anyone know a repeatable way to obtain different varieties of these types of berries? Because these are insanely useful for team building against boss fights and can completely save a run that you would have otherwise lost. If anyone knows, definitely let me know in the comments. Moving on to Route 202, our second encounter for the run will be none other than the Master of HM's Bidoof. And that really is the most useful thing about this line, in the fact that it can learn 6 HMs once fully evolved. In practice, Bibarel is just average. It comes with 2 pretty great abilities in Simple and Unaware, which can definitely have their uses. Bibarel also comes early at level 15, which is always a nice stat boost for the early game, but it will fall off pretty hard the further your game progresses. And when you combine the stat spread with the coverage options at Bibarel's disposal, it just has unfortunate written all over it. It's hard to justify utilizing Surf, Thunderbolt, and Ice Beam when your special attack is one of the worst you can have for a fully evolved Pokemon. But perhaps the most unfortunate part about this line is that you won't get Bibarel, a water type that gets Water Gun upon evolving, until after Gym Leader Rourke due to the level cap of 14. Additionally, once you do have a Bibarel, again a water type, he won't be very useful against the grass types coming up to and including the second gym in Eterna City. So even though Bibarel is a great early game Pokemon on paper, the matchups just don't line up very well. You can't even use it against Fantina now that I think about it, because her Mismagius has Magical Leaf. After plowing through the rest of Route 202, we finally reach our first major city in Jubilife. Looker is another big difference between Diamond and Pearl versus Platinum, and I don't know how to feel about him honestly. I like his theme music, I guess. After our encounter with the police, I move on to pick up several items that are littered around the city. This includes the hidden Stardust right outside of town, the Poketch, of course, with all of our fancy little apps, the old rod inside the building connecting Jubilife with Route 218, and finally the Quick Claw from Jubilife condominiums. Quick Claws are always very handy for any of your slower Pokemon, especially when it's this early in the game. You can battle a couple of trainers inside the trainer school to grab a potion, which is unfortunately a far worse reward than getting the TM for Hidden Power in Diamond and Pearl instead. Now, it is worth noting that at this point you can catch a guaranteed Magikarp on Route 218 with your newly obtained Old Rod. Gyarados does not need any explanation, obviously. He's incredible, probably the best Pokemon for a Nuzlocke of any game, and we're not going to be using one for this walkthrough. I've played with Gyarados 1,000 times, and I'm sure you guys have as well. Unless I lose the majority of my Pokemon during any given run, I just tend to ban Gyarados altogether. Plus, I want to try and use as many Gen 4 Pokemon as I can to get more familiar with them. Before we head to Orberg City to challenge our first gym leader, there are a few more routes to cover. North of Jubilife, we have Route 204, where we can pick up our next encounter. One of the things I definitely noticed with the Generation 4 games is that there are a ton of accessible encounters toward the beginning of the game, which definitely helps navigate the early stages. On Route 204, we ran into a Wurmple. Regardless of what this turns into, it's not very useful in the Generation 4 games, unfortunately. Dustox and Beautifly at least filled a very nice niche in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, as they both acted as hard counters to Brawly and the second gym. Dustox also had some uses later on against gym leaders like Norman, for example. In Platinum, though, they are both built pretty well to deal with Gardenia, the second gym leader, but so are a ton of other Pokemon, including our two primary party members at the moment in Starly and Chimchar. With that being said, we won't be using our little bug friend this run unless we need a strategic sacrifice. We've used the Wurmple line a lot in the past anyway. After crushing the remaining trainers on this route, we can actually pick up yet another encounter over in the Ravaged Path, which is the little cave that connects the northern and southern halves of Route 204. And it's a Zubat, which is always fantastic. Crobat is a top tier Pokemon in any game with the combination of his extremely high speed stat and excellent defensive typing. He won't hard counter anything in these games necessarily, but Crobat just matches up nicely against most Pokemon in general. I'll most likely bench him until, God forbid, my Starly goes down at some point. Just like Magikarp and Wurmple, I've used Crobat a million times, so we'll stick with our other options for now. Now we can start heading to Orberg, but wait, not only are there going to be about 3 more encounters along the way, no, I'm not joking, but we also run into our rival again right at the beginning of the route. Unlike in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, I would never ever take your rival fights in Platinum lightly, not even a single one of them. This one is fairly simple as long as you bring at least one Pokemon above level 10, I would say, and honestly you should have 2 for good measure. This battle is very easy to win, but also very easy to lose a Pokemon in if you take it for granted. Now to pick up our next encounter in Shinx. Another almost guaranteed encounter since there are so many spots where you can get one early on. This one doesn't come with the Intimidate ability, unfortunately. While Rivalry isn't the worst, it's just so much harder to manage as you progress through the run. You have to actually pay attention to your opponent's Pokemon and what gender they are so you can make the most out of it. It can definitely still be useful against quite a few boss fights though, but you'll need to make sure you do your homework. The only other problem I have with this line is that they want to lean heavily on that physical attack stat, but there aren't a whole lot of great electric type options to fill that role. Spark is fine, I guess, but it won't really feel very good in the later stages of the run. The silver lining here at least is that Luxray's special attack isn't too bad, so Thunderbolt will still hit pretty hard, and electric types in general are pretty useful throughout Sinnoh. As we enter Orberg Gate, I would highly recommend using the Repel that can be picked up on Route 203 right before you enter the cave. I would do this so you can delay your encounter here until after you get your encounter from Orberg Mines. Both locations have Geodudes, and you'll want to pick up that Geodude from the mines first so that you can guarantee a Psyduck from Orberg Gate. It's not a huge deal either way. Psyduck is a pretty average Pokemon overall, but it's a hell of a lot better than Onix in my experience. Unless you plan on evolving the Onix later, but honestly you have a couple of chances to capture a Steelix in the wild anyway, and I'm not playing with trait evolutions in this walkthrough, so yeah, I don't want this Onix. Finally in Orberg, and we get peer pressured immediately by some random kid lurking around the entrance to the city. I hate when they play music like this when NPCs drag you all of 5 freaking steps. Just keep the Orberg theme playing, it's good. And with that, this episode is now over. I wish we could have made it to gym number 1 at least, but there's a whole lot of content to cover in Gen 4's early game. We've still got 3 more encounters we can pick up before stepping foot in Orberg's gym, bringing the total to 9 Pokemon that you can obtain before the first badge. It's ridiculous. But in the next episode, we will definitely get through the rest of the early game slog, face off against Rourke, and keep the run moving forward. Please, please, please let me know if you like the new overlay, by the way, and if you find it helpful. I can always go back to the single screen setup, but I wanted to try something different for the new season. In the meantime, as usual, please like the video if you liked it, and subscribe for more content like this. That's it for me. I'll see you next time.